Today's video takes us straight into Mexico City, where thousands of young people have poured onto the streets in what has become one of the most significant youth-led protests the country has seen in recent years. What began as a sharp reaction to a brutal political assassination has now grown into a national conversation about violence, governance, and the limits of public patience in a country where security remains one of the most contested political battlegrounds. The demonstrations, loud, chaotic, and deeply emotional, have not only shaken the federal government, but have also revealed how profoundly Mexico's younger generation is beginning to shape the national political agenda. The trigger for these nationwide protests was the killing of Uruapan Mayor Carlos Manzo, who was shot dead on November 1st while attending a Day of the Dead festival. Manzo had gained significant attention in the months before his death for speaking bluntly about the presence of drug trafficking gangs in his town. His consistent calls for stronger state action against armed groups resonated with young voters across Michoacán, a state that has long struggled with cartel-linked violence. When he was assassinated in a public celebration, many young Mexicans interpreted it not just as the murder of a local leader, but as a symbol of how deeply violence has penetrated civic life. This emotional shock turned into political momentum, ultimately culminating in protests under the banner of Generation Z, a name adopted intentionally to differentiate the demonstrations from traditional party-based mobilization. The protests quickly spread to major cities across the country, but Mexico City became the epicenter. Thousands marched toward the National Palace, the residence of President Claudia Sheinbaum, turning the heart of the capital into a site of confrontation. Authorities reported that at least 120 people were injured during the clashes, including around 100 police officers. Out of those officers, 40 required hospitalization, indicating the intensity of the violence that erupted once demonstrators dismantled parts of the metal barricades protecting the National Palace. Riot police responded with tear gas, and security forces arrested 20 individuals on charges that included assault and robbery. Another 20 were taken in for administrative violations. Some groups in the crowd wore cowboy hats, a symbolic tribute to Manzo, while others carried banners declaring that the country was united in anger over his murder. What made these protests distinct was the involvement of a loosely organized youth coalition calling itself Generation Z Mexico. This group circulated a manifesto online claiming to be non-partisan, representing young people who feel frustrated with violence, corruption, and long-standing abuses of power. The movement has argued that the demonstrations were not an attack on any particular party, but rather a collective cry for a more secure and accountable state. However, the political atmosphere surrounding the protests quickly became contentious. President Claudia Sheinbaum stated that the marches were being supported financially by right-wing politicians who oppose her administration. In her public remarks before the demonstrations, she expressed support for freedom of expression, but insisted that citizens deserved transparency regarding the motivations behind the protest mobilization, even suggesting that social media bots played a role in amplifying the call to march. Sheinbaum is navigating a politically complex moment. Despite entering office with approval ratings above 70% and maintaining those high numbers through her first year, she has faced growing criticism over the persistence of violent crime. The president has been praised internationally for her progress in curbing fentanyl-related trafficking, an issue of major interest to the United States, especially under President Donald Trump's administration. But domestically, her challenge is balancing security operations with public demand for tougher measures. She has rejected calls for an all-out war on cartels, pointing to past administrations whose aggressive strategies resulted in large-scale bloodshed without dismantling criminal networks. Yet, as the protests demonstrate, a significant portion of the population, especially young people, believes that the current approach is not enough. particularly when high-profile assassinations continue to undermine public confidence. The political tensions extend beyond Mexico's borders. Earlier this month, Peru's Congress voted to declare President Sheinbaum persona non grata, escalating a diplomatic dispute that already included Peru severing ties with Mexico after a former Peruvian prime minister was granted asylum by the Mexican government. This international friction has placed additional pressure on Sheinbaum's administration at a time when her domestic critics are gaining confidence. For many young Mexicans, the combination of unresolved violence at home and political disputes abroad paints a picture of a government that is struggling to stabilize the country's position on both the domestic and international fronts. The wider context behind these protests reflects a deeper dissatisfaction with long-term national security conditions. For years, Mexico has experienced cycles of violence, cartel fragmentation, and regional instability. The murder of Manzo was a breaking point, but it was not an isolated incident. His death resonated because he represented a profile many young Mexicans relate to: outspoken, unafraid, and willing to confront entrenched criminal power structures. When demonstrators chanted that his death was a consequence of government failure, they were expressing a broader fear that institutions have become too weak to protect those who challenge violent groups. The fact that the protests were able to mobilize thousands across multiple states shows how widely this sentiment is shared, especially among younger citizens who feel they are inheriting a country trapped in a cycle of insecurity. At the same time, the political narrative surrounding these demonstrations remains highly contested. Government officials argue that opposition parties are leveraging public anger to undermine the administration, while protesters insist the movement is a spontaneous expression of frustration. Analysts observing the situation have noted that Mexican politics often experiences heightened tensions during periods of social unrest, especially when violence becomes a focal point. The combination of a politically active youth movement, a high-profile assassination, and a government defending its security record has created a complex national moment, one that could shape policy decisions, political alignments, and public sentiment in the months ahead. The protests in Mexico are ultimately a reminder of a broader pattern seen across many countries. When political violence becomes normalized and when public institutions struggle to deliver security, citizens, especially young people, step into the streets to reclaim their political voice. Whether the Generation Z Mexico movement grows into a sustained force or remains a momentary outburst, its emergence marks a significant shift in how Mexico's youth are choosing to engage with national issues. The bigger question is whether the government can respond in a way that addresses underlying grievances rather than merely contesting the legitimacy of the protests. The future of Mexico's stability depends not only on policing or cartel strategy, but also on rebuilding public trust in institutions. In a country where violence continues to overshadow civic life and where political debates increasingly intersect with broader questions of justice and security, the path forward requires more than managing a single protest. It requires rethinking how a nation protects its citizens while maintaining democratic accountability.